I'm going to continue with my match fishing memories, talking about our early ventures onto the open match circuit. It's 1975. Myself, Phil, Godfrey and Richard are all 18. I'm not sure who can drive yet. Philip's learning. I think Richard might have already passed his test. Another friend of ours, Colin Orchard, I think he came along with the matches, and one or two others. And at that time in 1975, there were matches being run by Pete Hutchinson on Hightown Lake and Spinnaker Lake and the Half Pit and the Roach Pit, all of which are big pits around Ringwood. They were very well run. Pete Hutchinson was match secretary of Ringwood Club, and the tickets were £3 all in, which doesn't sound very much, but this is 1975. I was earning, I think, well, there were various pay rises, a lot of pay rises that time, but about £30 a week. So that's representing half a day's wages just for the pools, but the payouts were good. There was a little bit for the ticket money, but you could win quite a lot of money if you won one of those matches, and they were 70 to 90 pegs. You were talking about 70 or 80 pounds for the winner, and even fifth place would get sort of 12 or 15 pounds. So pretty good payouts. The fishing though was pretty hard, and our first match that we decided to go on as an open, and I'm not sure who drove, how we got there, but we got there early one morning at Hightown Pits, which we'd never seen in our lives before. We turned up to fish, and there was this lovely pit. It's very different to what it is now. The level was quite low. There was water skiing on there later in the morning, and I drew in what was known as the annex, which is a sort of cut off bit from the main lake where the islands are. The fishing wasn't very good. I drew next to Jack Colgate, who was one of the Christchurch anglers, very experienced angler. He fished a little waggler, about 2 rod lengths out, 3 rod lengths out. I fished close in with a little cane antenna, and he picked up a few little skimmers, and they weren't very big and there weren't very many of them. But he ended up with £1.10, and that was enough to win a match with, I think, about 70 pegs. I got the section money with 10 ounces, which was pretty much one tiny perch and another perch that was nearly 10 ounces. So I won a few bob, and that was a good start. The other anglers from Wareham, I don't think they caught much at all. And on to the next match. 75 was a hot summer, not as hot as 76 would be, but it was still a hot summer. And the next match was split between the Roach Pit, which back then literally contained nothing but roach, and the Half Pit, which was quite shallow and coloured back then. Had quite a lot of little silver bream, little skimmers, small roach and tiny perch. And Ivan Mark's book on match fishing had just come out in 1975, and he was on about waggler fishing there and still water fishing. So I started to make wagglers out of drinking straws and balsa bodies that took about 2 treble A, a few number 8s down the line. And I drew on the Roach Pit, I forget where Phil was, and I picked up a mixture of little roach just like this, or ones about 4 ounces, 4 or 5 ounces, and ended up with about £4, which didn't win me anything. And I was about 10th out of 90, so quite a pleasing result really. And that was just fishing maggots with this slow drop, just sort of 3 number 8s down the line. I'd learnt from watching Jack Colgate, needed to up my game on float fishing. Very different to the fishing we were used to on breach, where the prolific little roach were close in, you just whipped them out one after another. This was much slower, much more delicate, much more of a waiting game. Did pick up the odd little roach, on the little ones were on the drop, but the bigger ones were when it settled. And then there was a third match, and I don't know if it was just on the Roach Pit or on the Roach Pit and the Half Pit again, about 70 pegs. And by now, in August, there was a maggot shortage, a crisis of maggots. All the flies used to breed the maggots had died in the heat wave. And we basically, myself, Richard and Philip, turned up for this match. I don't know if I think Philip drove us there, but his mother was with us to supervise him because he was a learner driver. So whether three of us got into their car, must have done. And our total maggots for three of us for an open match was 1/3 of a pint, which isn't much more than covers the bottom of a 2-pint bait box. And they weren't very good maggots either, and that was it. Took about feeding sparing, sort of 2 maggots in, 3 maggots in. That's all we could do. And it was the same for most people. Some people did get a few maggots. But Chris Love, who was a top London angler who'd won the Embassy a couple of years before, won the match with about 11 pounds of roach on bread punch. Phil came second. He had over 7 pounds and he won over 50 quid, which, to say, when average earnings were 30 quid a week, was probably about what he was on. That's not a bad payday. I was fifth with, Phil had 7.5 pounds. I had fifth with about 3.5 pounds, and Richard was seventh. So I won something like 13 pounds. I don't know if Richard got anything for seventh. He had about 2.5 pounds. So the weights were pretty hard, and the little roach that we'd had before, they didn't show. It was just better roach, just this sort of feeding very, very sparing. And I think making up the frame, there was a ringwood angler, can't remember his name, had about 6 pounds, and Steve Gardner had 5 pounds. He was fourth and I was fifth. Did learn a lesson from that. Steve Gardner also fished bread punch, and when I caught up with him many, many years later, when the biography of him came out, I mentioned this match about him fishing punch, and he could remember it. So it shows what a good memory the top match anglers often have of notable matches, even though he didn't win. And I learnt something from that, in that the following week we had a match against Dorchester on Breach, and by then we could not buy maggots at all. I don't know what people did for bait, but I certainly fished bread punch. Of course, we had ground bait, that was no problem, and won the match the following week with bread punch. Some of the Dorchester guys did have some maggots. I think they got them in Somerset, but there were no maggots for us at all. They'd all gone by then. So that was the first 3 open matches. We were very, very naive. We're 18. We're suddenly up against much better anglers. When you're saying about people like Chris Love and Steve Gardner, we're up against the top Southampton anglers, the best anglers from Christchurch and Ringwood, and elsewhere. I don't know where everyone came from, really. Fished a couple more opens that year. There was one on Ham Preston on the Stour. There used to be an annual match. Nowadays it's a club water for Ringwood, but back then every September the water would be opened for one day at the Ham Preston Charity Open, and the Trehane family would nominate a charity to be benefited, and the ticket money would go to that. That was pretty disastrous as far as I was concerned. I had a couple of ounces of bleak. I think it was one with about 28 pounds a good dace by one of the top Christchurch anglers, and Godfrey unfortunately drew next to him at about 10 ounces. He was totally outclassed. And the other open match I fished that year was, I used to stay on the Thames at Wolvercote in the 70s and 80s, and there was a North Oxford Open, and North Oxford were part of the Oxford and District Association back then, and they had an open match that had one section above Godstow and 2 sections on Medley, and I entered this match. And back in 1975, proper matches like that were all to size limits, which I'd never fished before. That was a bit of an eye-opener. People pulling fish out left, right and centre and putting all of them back. Chub, it was 12 inches. Bream, it was 12 inches, which meant just about, well, we'll say all silver bream went back. You couldn't weigh in a silver bream. The chance of getting one over 12 inches were virtually nil back in those days. I don't know what perch were, probably about 9 inches, and roach probably something like 7 inches. Bleak were about 4 inches. And the going bait at that time, after what had been a hot summer, had been hemp and tares. Well, I'd never fished hemp and tares, but I managed to cook some tares and some hemp, and I turned up and fished hemp and tares at least for an hour or so, and I did get one nice roach, about 10 ounces on tares, but I didn't know how to feed the swim. I didn't have the confidence to fish hemp and tares for 5 hours, which is what I really needed. Didn't have the finesse, probably didn't have the right hooks and the right bait, and so I ended up fishing with maggots, catching lots of fish, that all of which were undersized apart from half a dozen bleak. So I chucked back about 4 pounds of tiddlers. I've already mentioned Chris Love, who was on this match, and I drew next to him, and he proceeded to fish a bodied waggler well across the river with hemp and caster, catching lots of roach and lots of dace and the odd small chub, but only weighing in about 2.5 pounds. Size limits were so disheartening back in those days that you could catch 8 or 9 pounds of fish and weigh in a couple of pounds. From what I remember, about 3 chub for 8 pounds won the match. It was 3 chub for 8 pounds, 2.5 pound fish. So 2.5, 3 pounds. So it was a bit of an eye-opener, and a lot of people were starting to agitate to get rid of the size limits. The London anglers seemed to be keen on them, but further up the Thames Valley, Oxford and Reading, they weren't very keen on them. And a couple of years later, I fished a Barclays annual team match on the Thames at Radcut, and those size limits were supposed to be enforced, we just totally ignored them. Just put every fish in the net and didn't care. Thames Water, who were meant to be enforcing it, weren't that bothered. The following year we were still keen on the opens, but it was obviously a tough thing to do. We fished the Hightown Open again, and this time we had the mega heat wave, and I'm making this video in what is part of a very, very hot spell of weather in 2022. And this was the 76 heat wave, when it was over 90 Fahrenheit every day for 10 days. Preparation is everything, and it was so hot at that time. If you put we were all fishing with maggots basically. If you had a bait box full of maggots in the sun during the middle of the day, the maggots just died. They just got hyperactive and expired. And although people talk about fishing with dead maggots nowadays, back then we wanted live maggots to fish for little roach and silver bream and so on. So first thing I did was take an umbrella, so I sat under my umbrella in this extreme heat. I didn't draw particularly well, caught a pound or so, but Richard did win that match. So that was Richard was starting to pack in the match fishing back then, but he came along on that one. He got into the Territorial Army later that year, but he had about 6 pounds, won the match, which was fantastic. One memory I do have of that match is that I had a wide-mouthed vacuum flask, and I took 3 ice lollies, cut the handles down a little bit, and then packed the flask with chopped up ice cubes and the 3 lollies in there. And at intervals during the match, I sat there eating a lolly, and the fishing was pretty hard, and people were walking around trying to find shady spots. And people would see me with the ice lolly, and they said, "Where'd you get that from?" I said, "There's a guy going around selling them. Have you missed him? You look out for him." All these people were running around. "Where's the bloke with the ice lolly?" "I haven't seen anyone." Blah, blah, blah. "Where are you getting the ice lollies from, Mark?" And in the end, I said, "Well, I've got a flask full of ice here." So it's all right. It was a bit hot. This year, for the first time, we were also fishing Spinnaker Lake, which is a well-known pit. It's also called the sailing pit at Ringwood. Nowadays, it's quite deep. It was deepened in the mid-80s to become a reservoir, and it's still got sailing on it, probably paddleboarding and all the rest of it. Nowadays there are big tench, lots of roach, quite a few rudd, and a few big carp, probably a few pike. Back then it was quite shallow, 5 or 6 foot deep in most of it, the odd deep spots. Very coloured because it was still being worked, and full of silver bream. Silver bream like coloured water, so when the colour did go, after they stopped working it, the silver bream quickly vanished and never been seen since. Apart from the silver bream, there were a few small roach, the very occasional bronze bream, but only a pound or so, the odd roach bream hybrid, the very odd tench, pound and a half, and a few little tiny perch, again these little tiny perch. And Christchurch were running opens on there, and one of them was an embassy qualifier, and I did quite well on there with about £5, came 5th and qualified for the embassy semi-final to be held at Denham, which was not a very good experience, but you had to draw right, and the couple of other opens I fished on there didn't do very good at all, got 3 or 4 ounces, so very much a tough learning experience on there. Techniques were coming on, we were getting better at fishing a waggler on still water, making floats out of peacock quill, getting the hang of what bait we needed. Again, having problems in the heat, using umbrellas to shade the bait. Nowadays people have shades over their bait trays. Back then you just got under an umbrella and shaded you as well as the bait. The final one I'm just going to quickly say about was this embassy semi-final. Now I didn't drive then, probably should have been driving by then, but I didn't. And so I relied on Phil qualifying. Well, he didn't qualify on that one on the Open, but Christchurch ran a club match that was an embassy qualifier as well, and it was about 50 pegs. And the top, it depended on how many embassy tickets went through, and it was 1 in 10, but they obviously had over 30 tickets. And we fished the Hampshire Avon for the very first time in this club match. There were a couple of 19-pound weights, and Phil had 17 pounds a day, so he qualified as well. And we were ready for this embassy qualifier that was going to be held on some pits at Denham in Buckinghamshire, just outside London, in the September. And we had no idea how long it would take us to get to Denham from Dorset. It's about 100 miles. And of course, if you set off very early in the morning, the roads are pretty quiet, so there's no queues of traffic. Back in those days, no Winchester bypass like there is now. There was a bypass, and that wasn't a very good one. And we got up to Denham at about 5:45 in the morning. The draw was about 8 o'clock. God knows what time we'd been awake from. And in the end, we caught a few ounces each. The pit I was on, there were 100 pegs on each pit. I think just 2 qualified for the first 10 out of the 100. And the other 8 qualifiers all caught great big slabs, great big bream on the pit that was Phil was on, but he just had 5 or 6 ounces. I think I had about 4 ounces. And about 4 hours in on this match, the guy next to me finally got a bite on the tip, probably with a bomb there, and he's playing this fish as if his life depended on it. It's a bream, but it wasn't that big. It wasn't a great big slab. It was about 2¼ pounds, and we knew nothing was being caught on our pit, so he assumed, oh, I'm on my way to Denmark. Weighed in he had about 2½ pounds, but he needed 5 pounds to qualify, so he was a little bit overexcited, shall we say. And then we had the trauma of getting home with a crash that closed the Winchester bypass on the old lights there. So we ended up weaving our way through the middle of Winchester to get home. Took hours. Got home absolutely exhausted. Fell asleep. The next thing I knew, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. So that was our first 2 years open match fishing. A baptism of fire, to say the least. I hope you've enjoyed this one. There's plenty more I want to talk about in different matches over the years, winter leagues, open matches, different teams, and what happened in all sorts of matches. So that's goodbye for now.